Edward Manet fills the sort of fascinating in between the realist style and the really truly modern styles that we see with Impressionism and later. He is not truly an Impressionist. He is not a realist, even though he tries to be one. He's definitely not a romantic painter. So he does not really necessarily have a particular style that we can say Manet belongs to. What he does instead is actually develop his own style that sort of paves the way for what's going to happen over the next sort of 40 to 50 years in modern art. Um, Manet really shocked the public with his art. He was not accepted by the French salons, which kind of ruled what was stylish and what was happening in art at the time, even though he sort of desperately wanted to be accepted by them. So one of his earliest paintings is Luncheon on the Grass, or Déjeuner sur l'herbe. It plays off of some older images. So for example, this painting by Titian called Concert Champêtre is where we get this kind of arrangement of four figures, two women, two men. But what Manet does here is puts these figures into a contemporary context. So there are actually real figures here that people might have known. Manet's brother Eugène is included here. The woman on the far left that is totally in the nude is a woman named Victoire, and she actually was a pretty common model for Manet. She worked with him quite frequently. And to show her here totally in the nude is not actually, at first glance, so shocking. If you look back at Concert Champêtre, both of the women are totally in the nude here. But the difference is that Victoire seems to be, sorry, not Victoire, Victorine. Victorine seems to be somewhat aware of the fact that she is actually not wearing clothing. If you look on the far left in the corner, you actually see that she has taken her clothes off. They're sort of strewn on the grass. She is sitting on part of her petticoat. She seems to be telling us, especially with this very engaged look, she looks us right in the eyes, that she is on purpose not wearing clothing. So whereas these two women are potentially some kind of nymph or allegorical figure that may or may not actually be there, the figures don't seem to be aware of either of them. Victorine is actually a present participating piece of the picture here. We know because this figure is indicating her with his hand. Her legs are kind of draped in between his. They make a sort of trio that seems to be in a conversation together, indicating to the viewer that she's quite aware of the fact that she's not wearing clothing, and the two other figures probably are as well. The figure in the background is a little bit harder to include in the group. She is partially undressed. She has the bottoms of her clothing on, but not her top, but she's also not quite as exposed. She's also a little bit removed from the image, so it doesn't feel quite so confrontational. But in addition to this nudity being, and I want to make the distinction here between nudity and nakedness. I would say Titian's image is nude. Manet's image has nakedness. But in addition to that, people also really objected to the flatness of this image. So if you look at the foreground, there's a lot of detail here. It's pretty realistic, not so far off from the realist styles that we've already looked at. But as you move back into the landscape, here you can almost see the canvas behind it, which was, at this point, a total forbidden thing in painting. The goal of a painted image was to make the viewer forget that there was a canvas underneath. Make images that looked so believable that you wouldn't even remember that it was a painting. But with this flatness, Manet actually reminds us that the image is painted onto a picture screen, that it is in fact a painted image, and that all of his choices are very consciously made. So these things together kind of really offended the French public, and Manet got a lot of negative feedback for it. He similarly got negative feedback for his image Olympia. This one plays off another Titian image that we looked at previously, this one of Venus. And in the Olympia, we again have a woman who seems quite conscious of her nakedness. Again, we know that because we see her shoes still on. She has her jewelry, but she's got her robe kind of strewn underneath of her. She's also laying on a bed with really wrinkled sheets, which indicate maybe that they've been used recently. This is, again, the same woman. This is Victorine, once again. And she also kind of forcibly covers her body. So if we go back to the Titian image, Venus's arm is kind of lazily draped. She happens to cover this part of her body, but there's nothing forced about it. It all seems very natural. She's looking at the viewer, but her head is kind of tilted to the side, which makes it a little coquettish. In this image, Victorine's hand is kind of splayed on her lap, and it draws attention to that with the outstretched fingers. She's also really sort of challenging the viewer. Her look isn't coquettish at all. It's harsh. It's staring you in the face. It's saying, yes, I know I'm not wearing any clothes. Look at me. We also have this figure in the background, this servant who is bringing her a bouquet of flowers. There's an indication there that there's maybe a caller waiting for her, which again reiterates this perception that her nakedness is intentional. There is also this tiny little black cat in the far right. If we look back at Titian, there was the little dog. If you may remember from last week, it was about love. But a black cat is associated with superstition, witchcraft. There are a lot of sort of negative connotations with the black cat. So putting that in there is, again, just another sort of negative aspect. People also took issue with the fact of his outlining process. You know, there are these sort of defined outlines around much of the image. And if you look at the Titian, it's very soft. Everything is painterly. Everything is blended together well. Again, you're reminded in Manet's version of this image that it is painting. You can't create an illusion that this is somewhere distant. You feel the real world, and people really, really rejected that particular perception. So Manet really helps to free up the canvas so that when the Impressionists come along, they have a lot of flexibility to kind of do whatever they want with their painted images. So we're going to just do a quick run through of some of the main Impressionists. Monet is kind of one of the leaders. He is where the group actually gets their name from with this particular image, Impression Sunrise. A critic looked at it in a first show and said, that's not a sunrise, that's an impression of a sunrise. And the group sort of said, well, yes, of course, that's what Impressionism is. Impressionism really is open air painting. They would actually go outside and paint. It's called en plein air. And there's a lot of landscape. They, for the most part, avoided the color black. They wanted to try and capture the feeling of the world rather than the details of the world. So there's a lot of quick brush strokes. Monet was known for painting very, very quickly. He would do many different versions of the same image, looking at different times of day to get the different lighting effects. Renoir also really liked outdoor images, but he liked to include figures in his pictures. So we see here in Moulin de la Galette, a sort of moment in modern Parisian life. This would have been an outdoor beer garden. We see the mix of sort of old world with electric lighting. The idea of leisure time is a very modern thing as the Industrial Revolution is giving people the opportunity to have more free time. They can go out on the weekends, they can dance, they can enjoy the day. And then the fact of the electric lighting means that when the sun goes down, the party doesn't stop. They don't have to be home at dusk. There's also this interesting contrast of natural lighting. You see this sort of dappling of sunlight coming through the leafy trees up above. So there's a lot of energy and happiness and modern excitement to Renoir's work. Degas is actually of the same generation as Manet. He's a little bit older than most of the Impressionists, but he is a true Impressionist, while Manet does not actually qualify as an Impressionist. However, he breaks some of the rules. He likes to use the color black. His color palette tends to be a little bit harsher. He also tends to like to show some of the less refined aspects of modern life. So he does a lot of pictures of dancers, like this one here, the dance class. Dancing is actually not, at the time, really considered a really high-end profession. People who go to see the ballet are the aristocrats. People who are in the ballet tend to be working class. And so we're looking here at an image of the working class. We see their instructor, we see the girls practicing, but also a really interesting use of perspective, which is typical of Degas. There's a lot of open space here on the bottom right, with most of the activity happening on the upper left. And he does this in many of his images. There's also a slightly harsher quality to the paint colors that he chooses. It's definitely not that light, airy brushstroke style that we see with Monet and Renoir. Berthe Morisot is one of two women who are part of the official Impressionist group. She is also of the same age as Manet and Degas. She is actually married to Manet's brother. And her style is actually one of the most heavy-handed and I would say expressionistic styles, meaning that the brush strokes are really, really heavily applied to the canvas. She is also confined in the subject matter. We talked about Rosa Bonheur having restrictions about what she had access to. So did Morisot. As a woman, she couldn't go to the same public spheres. She couldn't go to these beer halls without a chaperone. She lived in the suburbs, didn't technically go to the city all that often. So she paints things that she has access to, which often are images of women and children. So here we're looking at an image called the wet nurse. A wet nurse is someone who would have been hired by an aristocratic family to feed young children so that the woman didn't have to do that for herself, which was often thought of as kind of demeaning. So she's a working class person, but here she is taking care of probably a wealthy child. And she's in this very hard to read landscape. We know it's a landscape because of the greenery. We see the outline of an umbrella. It's contrasted by the light pink and white colors of their clothing. But the image is not detailed. You don't know who exactly this woman is. She becomes representative of pretty much any working class woman. Mary Cassatt is the other woman who is a member of the Impressionist group. She is likewise a little more confined by her access to content. She's also the only American included in the Impressionist group. So Little Girl in a Blue Armchair shows a little bit of this soft emotion. You feel for this little girl. She seems to be having maybe a pouty moment. She didn't get what she wants. But there's also this fascinating perspective where she is kind of almost sliding off the canvas at the bottom. You know, better perspective at the background, but very flattened at the bottom, which is very typical of her style. She also does similar things to Degas with use of space. They actually work together pretty closely, so there are a lot of comparisons between their styles. As we move past the true Impressionist period, which only lasted for about 8 years or so, we start to see a period we refer to as neo-impressionism, which is not a focus on one particular style. There are actually a lot of different styles within neo-impressionism, but essentially it means a new approach to the Impressionist philosophy. So one of these is Georges Seurat, who develops the pointillist style, which is a painstaking process of putting tiny dots of paint on the canvas. And he would use contrasting colors. So, for example, if you look at this woman's purple dress, there's also a lot of green and brown in there because he works on color theory that says that a contrasting color in small amounts will also help another color really stand out. So these processes take a very long time. He would grid off the painting. He would work for many, many months at a time on the same painting, sometimes years, and as a result did very few of them. It also didn't grow that popular as a style because it was so difficult to work on. And whereas Impressionism paintings are typically filled with life, there is kind of a rigidity to this, as if these people are kind of frozen in time. And that's kind of where the science contrasts the liveliness of the Impressionist paintings. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec really focused on the bohemian underside of Paris. He spent a lot of time in Montmartre, at the famous Moulin Rouge dance club, which was a can-can dance club. So you see here a woman named Jeanne Avril. She was one of the famous dancers at the Moulin Rouge. We have these kind of seedier, darker colors. The green is kind of an effect of the gas lights that would have been used at this time. You see a lot of men who would have been able to go out in these spaces, and only a few women, most of whom probably were not the most respectable of women. It's also a much flatter sort of illustrated style than a lot of the other painters we're looking at. Vincent van Gogh and also Paul Gauguin are particularly well known for their expressionist styles. There's a lot of emotion in their painting. In Van Gogh, we see a lot of heavy-handed painting style. It's called impasto. If you were to look at the canvas, you would really be able to see the paint. And in Gauguin, we see a lot of expression of his own sort of personal struggles to figure out who he is. He sort of leaves France and tries to find this pure, unadulterated form of life and ends up in Tahiti.